the cradle of survival geography and the Natufians. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, we travel to an oasis on the edge of the desert, where a steady spring feeds a low mound, built up by many generations. This place is Jericho. People often call it the first city on earth. But what makes a city anyway? Walls and towers, stores of grain, craft, and trade, or a community that stays and rebuilds on the same spot, over and over. We will trace the story from hunters camping near the water to the first farmers, forming mud brick homes around courtyards. We'll examine the great stone tower and the early walls, the layers of rebuilding, the rituals that honored the dead, and the trade routes that carried obsidian, salt, and ideas. Then, we will follow Jericho into later epochs, where kings and merchants left their marks, and legend met archaeology. As always, I'd like to know where you are listening from and what time it is. Settle in, breathe slow, and let the past come into focus. This is a story thousands of years old, and tonight it is yours. Let us begin. Stand on the floor of the Jordan Rift Valley at the place later called Tali Sultan, and you will feel geography performing work no king or general could match. The land lies about $260 million below sea level. The air is warm and still. To the west, the Judean hills rise like a rock wall. To the east, the Jordan River slips toward the Dead Sea. In the middle of this dry amphitheater, a freshwater spring bubbles out of the limestone and refuses to stop. If you had to choose one point in the Levant where nomadic people might first try to stay put, this would be it. At the end of the last ice age, the climate shifted from cold and unstable to milder. Wild cereals spread across the valley edges. Herds of gazelle grazed the steppe. About 12,000 years ago, groups we call Natufian gatherers were already lingering near rich patches of food. For much longer than a single season, they left behind flint blades with a glossy sheen that comes from harvesting grasses. They left heavy mortars and pestles for pounding seeds. They left the first hints that the annual cycle of movement was giving way to something more rooted. The Jericho oasis drew them as a predictable pantry and a good place to sleep. The oasis as stabilizer, the first homes, the spring at Jericho was more than just a water source. It was a stabilizer. A reliable flow meant that dry years did not force people to leave. It meant gardens could be scratched out on the floodplain. It meant reeds for mats and thatch were always close at hand. When families decided to try to stay for the entire year, they built accordingly. The earlier structures were round or oval, often partly dug into the ground, with low stone foundations and walls of mud brick or packed clay. Roofs were likely thatch and wood, pitched to shed the rare but strong rains. Inside, a central hearth darkened the ceiling. Along the edges were bins and shallow storage pits. The floors were sometimes covered with smooth white plaster, made by heating limestone until it turned to quicklime, then slaking it with water and applying it like wet chalk. This recipe requires a fire hot enough to change stone and the audacity to try it. It tells us that curiosity was already a survival skill. Daily life left a dense set of clues. Grinding stones, worn into smooth depressions, show that seeds were milled into flour. Sickle blades with bright polish show that people were cutting stalks of barley and wheat. Charred plant remains include wild barley and wild wheat, whose grains are small by later standards. Some scholars argue that early Jericho residents were already encouraging these grasses to grow more densely around their homes by weeding and watering. Others argue that full domestication came later. The truth is likely complex and local. People here experimented. They gathered, they planted, they watched which patches responded. Over a few centuries, these experiments changed both the plants and the people. Animals helped bridge the gap between hunting and husbandry. Gazelle bones are common in early Jericho deposits, a reminder that meat was still hunted. In the wider region, dogs were beginning to live near, rather than apart from, people. Even if we can't name a Jericho dog yet, the partnership was spreading. Domesticating companions who could help find game or warn of danger made permanent dwellings safer. It also made sleeping in the same spot night after night, less risky. Burials draw us closer to their notions of family and place. In many early homes, the dead were interred beneath the packed floors. The living slept over the ancestors who were remembered. This practice ties a household to its land with bonds stronger than any wall. It also reveals the slow birth of shared memory. Centuries later, in the same mound, plastered human skulls inlaid with shells would stare out at archaeologists from beneath floors and benches. These famous faces belong to a slightly later phase, but the habit of viewing homes as family vaults began in the earliest levels. To live in Jericho was to live with your past. The site itself grew the way only long-lived villages do, as a mound of layered houses and swept courtyards. When a building collapsed, people leveled the top and built again. When floods from winter storms cut gullies, people filled them and repaired. The mound rose slowly, a meter here, a meter there. Each rise recorded a generation of cooking, smoke, and repair. Archaeologists read this layered archive with tools that would have puzzled those first villagers. Charcoal and seeds are sent to radiocarbon labs. Microscopic slices of packed floor reveal lenses of ash and plaster recipes. Stone flakes and bone fragments mark the corners where work and eating happened. The neat maps and graphs that result are merely modern ways of seeing the daily routine of a few hundred people who took a chance on staying. Shared obligation, a precursor to the city trade connections, show that even a rooted community was not isolated. Among the beads and trinkets at Jericho are shells from the Mediterranean coast and perhaps the Red Sea. Some blades in the region were made of obsidian, a volcanic glass that must have traveled many days. From Anatolian sources, bitumen from the Dead Sea Basin could be pressed into sickle handles as glue, or used to waterproof baskets. These materials are less about luxury imports than they are about threads in a web of visits and gift exchange that bound the valleys and coasts together. Sedentary life does not mean a small world. It means a world organized by returns, not one-way trips. The numbers are difficult to pin down exactly, but the scale of early Jericho is striking. Imagine a community of a few hundred people who could muster dozens of hands to raise a house in a week. Imagine the paths trodden by feet between clusters of circular dwellings. Imagine small garden plots near the spring and larger fields a short walk away, where someone stands guard while others weed. Imagine the soundscape: reed mats scraping underfoot, grinding stones humming as women mill, children scraping mud into bricks, someone playing a bone flute in the twilight. The village smells of smoke, wet plaster, and pounded grain. The why here and why now questions are big ones, and Jericho offers unusually clear answers. Geography provided water and warmth. The end of the glacial climate provided a longer growing season. Human ingenuity provided the rest. The people who settled this oasis learned to rework limestone into plaster, encourage plants to feed them more reliably, and store enough to survive the lean months. Every small improvement entailed a larger obligation. A plastered floor begs to be swept. A storage bin asks to be filled. A field asks to be weeded and watered. The feedback loop of comfort and obligation is how villages become communities. There were also costs. Permanent settlement locks you into cycles of disease that migrating groups might avoid. It makes you an attractive target for anyone bold enough to take what you have saved. It breeds disputes over fields and water rights. Early Jericho knew these costs. We see them in healed fractures, in layers that hint at flood damage and rebuilding, and in the careful placement of homes to share the light and breeze. What we do not see in this first chapter is a garrison mentality. The famous stone tower and the broad defensive earthworks came slightly later. Jericho's first phase is about learning to stay, not learning to fight. From a distance, the earliest Jericho would not have looked like a city in the modern sense. There are no paved streets or grand temples. There is no market square. There is only a build-up of human intention and a spring. Yet, by what it took to build and maintain it, by the way it organized labor and memory, it is one of the first places on earth to behave like a city. People here committed to an address. They planted their future beside the spring and expected their children to inherit both the work and the reward. Centuries later, Projects so large they still amaze archaeologists would sprout in the mound. Stone towers, surrounding earthworks, new rituals, and new materials. Those are the subjects of the next part. For now, the story is simpler and just as remarkable. A few families camped by good water. They stayed for the winter. They built with mud and stone. They learned to harvest and store. In doing so, they discovered that a place could hold a community the way a jar holds grain. The tower and walls, the riddle of purpose. Once the first generations at Jericho learned how to stay, they didn't stop with floors and storage bins. They looked outward at the slope that held the spring and re-engineered the landscape itself. The project was audacious for people without metal tools or draft animals. They built a stone wall that encircled the settlement and dug a deep ditch outside it. Inside this circle, they erected a stone tower so tall it still stuns visitors who see photographs from the excavation. The tower rises about 8 or 9 meters. In modern terms, that's a 3-story building, constructed by villagers who shaped each stone block with stone hammers and stacked them one by one on a clay mortar. Archaeologists first discovered the wall and tower in the 20th century. Working in the lowest layers of the mound, the wall is made of field stones stacked into a thick barrier, more than 1.5 meters wide in places. In front of it is a ditch cut into the marl and limestone. The ditch is several meters wide and several meters deep and follows the curve of the wall. Like a shadow, the tower stands immediately inside the wall. Its base is a circle of fitted stones. Inside, a narrow staircase of over 20 steps rises to a platform at the top. The steps are worn along the center line where feet once passed. This detail tells us the tower was not a showcase built and abandoned. People used it. The first question everyone asks is, why? Defense is the obvious guess. A wall and ditch make attackers work hard. Yet, there is no clear evidence of armies in this era that could besiege the place. Another practical answer is flood control. Winter storms sometimes break from the Judean hills and rush through wadis to the valley floor. The ditch and the stout wall would slow the water and hold the edge of the settlement in place. A third answer lies between practicality and theatre. The tower is a stone exclamation point. It is visible from afar. It says, this community is organized and strong. It offers a point from which to conduct surveillance and a symbol around which to tell stories. A fourth possibility is stone timekeeping. Some researchers have argued that the tower and the western ridge create a horizontal marker that catches the sun at a specific season. Even if the precise alignment with the sun is debated, the idea fits the needs of early farmers. Planting and harvesting depend on cycles that must be remembered and shared. A marker that gathers the community at a predictable moment is a calendar you can climb. The staircase inside, the narrow entrance, and the small platform on top all hint at a ritual of some kind. We don't know the words that were spoken there, but we can picture the audience. Children looking up, elders leaning on staffs, everyone listening for the dates that matter. However we explain its purpose, the tower is a lesson in organization. The stones are heavy, some weighing more than a strong person could lift alone. The blocks were quarried from the nearby slope and hauled to the site. The clay mortar had to be mixed and carried. The staircase had to be set with care, so each step rested solidly on the one below. The structure had to rise quickly enough that seasonal rains would not dissolve the unfinished courses. This implies a labor force large enough to sustain a pace for many weeks. A reasonable estimate is hundreds of people, with crews for quarrying, carrying, mixing, laying, and finishing. A project of this size implies leadership and planning, and it implies food stores to feed workers who were not hunting or weeding fields. While the wall and tower went up, the wall and ditch carry similar engineering lessons. Digging a trench into bedrock with stone picks is slow, repetitive work. It requires patience and a plan for disposing of the spoil. The curve of the ditch is consistent, meaning people were measuring as they dug. The wall behind it is thick and slightly battered, leaning inward to resist pressure. This geometry is not accidental. It is the result of trial and error. Even the decision to face the exterior with larger stones and fill the core with smaller rubble shows a practical understanding of how to create a stable mass out of irregular parts. Communication and the architecture of civility. Consider the acoustics and the view from the tower. From the platform's top, a person can see the bend of the wadi, the pale line of the river to the east, and the dark wall of the highlands to the west. A shout from this height carries over the clustered roofs and courtyards. The beat of a drum or the call of a horn organizes labor quickly. In this way, the tower is a communication tool as well as a symbol. It connects the community to its perimeter and makes the edge of the settlement audible. If danger approached from the wadi, a lookout could warn those in the fields. If a flood began, a cry could send people to protect the storehouses and open the channels. The wall also defines a social boundary. Inside the perimeter are the homes, the hearths and the graves. Outside are the fields, the herds and the strangers. This line matters in a new kind of life where property and storage create temptation. A wall with a single, narrow gate turns a cluster of homes into a town with a front door. Controlling the gate creates rules about who enters and when. Rules create councils or elders who enforce them. In this sense, Jericho's first architecture is also its first lesson in civility. The materials are stone and mud. The result is habit and law. Placing the tower in Jericho's timeline gives it even more weight. The structure belongs to the very earliest Neolithic phase, long before pottery or metal. It is older than the great temples of the Fertile Crescent, and older than the stone monuments on distant shores. It stands on the threshold where villages become more than just a survival strategy. In time, the people of Jericho would model their ancestors in plaster and place those faces in places of honor. They would refine their building methods and learn to terrace slopes and move water. The tower is an ancestor of these later achievements. It taught them how to marshal labor and sustain a project against setbacks. If you have ever tried to move a rock with friends, you know what such work does to a group. It exhausts and it bonds. Someone starts a chant that marks time. Someone finds a better path to the foundation. Someone spots the first hairline crack in the mortar joint and calls everyone back to reset a course. The victory at the end is not just the hoisting of the top course into place. It is the knowledge that you have all done something that will still be standing when your grandchildren climb the stairs. This is how monuments create memory before writing exists. There is one more practical consequence of wrapping a settlement in stone. It changes how the community thinks about growth. New homes must respect the wall. Alleyways must find a path to the gate. Waste must be carried out, not left to the wind. These constraints breed order. They turn random clusters into neighborhoods. They turn footpaths into streets. At Jericho, this process begins here. The wall and the tower are not just big things. They are organizing ideas. Look once more at the setting. The spring continues to flow. The fields beyond the ditch are green after the winter rains. The river shines silver in the morning light. On the tower, a watchman squints along the ridge of the western hills to observe the sun marking its slow transit. The village that started as a clever camp has become a place that expects a future. You can feel it in the stone under your palm and in the view from the top. You can hear it in the sound of feet climbing the stairs to check the sky and the fields. If the earliest Jericho was a brave, the oasis became a city in a fuller sense. The small round homes of the first settlers gave way to rectangular rooms organized into districts. Footpaths hardened into streets. Storage pits evolved into standardized jars stacked in orderly storehouses. People still woke to the murmur of the spring, but now the sound mixed with the habits of an urban day. Ovens heated before dawn. Donkeys clattered through the gate under wicker baskets. A scribe pressed a seal into damp clay to mark a delivery that would be accounted for later. This is the moment when Jericho joins the new world of cities that sprung up almost at once, across the southern Levant and beyond. It is also the moment the oasis became the heart of a small economic system, not a self-sufficient village. To understand what changed, stand again at the mound archaeologists call Tel Sultan and jump forward in time to about 5,000 years ago. The community that emerges here is not accidental. It is the result of the stable water source, a wide fan of arable land, and the old road that threads the Jordan Valley. That road carried obsidian, shells, and stories long before this. Now, it begins to carry goods at scale. Salt from the Dead Sea, grain from the fields, wool from herds that graze the steppe in winter and move up to the hills in summer. Copper ingots that were hammered far to the north and east. At Jericho, all of it could be taxed, traded, and redirected. Geography made it possible, but organization made it real. The first signal of this new organization is the plan of the city itself. Houses change from round to rectangular. Walls align with neighbors in a way that implies a shared idea of a street. Many houses are not single rooms but complexes of spaces arranged around a small courtyard. There are workrooms with raised platforms for grinding and food preparation. There are long, narrow rooms where storage jars stand shoulder to shoulder, each with a pointed base that settles into a ring of clay or a shallow pit to keep the jar from tipping over. The change in shape matters. Rectangular rooms stack better. They allow for straight runs of roofing timbers. They create standard corners where furniture and storage bins can be pegged. Once you choose a straight wall, you can keep building it. The resulting architecture is more than a shelter. It is a tool for dividing labor and controlling goods. Standardization and water control. A second signal lies in the pottery that fills these rooms. Early Bronze Age potters at Jericho built vessels that were both practical and confident. They have high shoulders and sharp rims that allow ropes to bite when jars are secured for transport. Some are coated in red slip and burnished to a gleam, like grains on a sunny day. Others are thick-walled storage containers of a uniform capacity, repeated again and again. The repetition is the crucial part. Standard jars make standardized measures. When a shipment of grain arrives at a warehouse, the full jars can be counted, not guessed at in piles. When grain is dispensed to workers digging a canal or building a wall, a supervisor can record the number of jars sent out and the number of empties returned. The ceramic style is a window into arithmetic and administration. The city needs more than jars to manage surplus. It needs rooms that belong to the community, not the family. In this period at Jericho, we begin to see large buildings that are not homes. Some are long halls with buttresses, walls thick enough to carry massive roofs. Some have plastered floors and carefully fitted door frames. Their contents are simple: jars, hearths, grinding stones. But the scale and the upkeep tell us these rooms mattered to many. They are warehouses and meeting places, and likely offices in a world without papyrus writing. Every new course of brick laid on their walls carried social weight. You can feel that weight in the way the floors were renewed again and again with smooth white plaster. Each layer is a receipt from another season of use. The people who managed these buildings were not kings in the sense of later epochs. They were household heads, lineages, and councils. Their power came from the harvest, the flocks, and the ability to move water. The Jericho spring was always a gift. In the early Bronze Age, it becomes an engineered resource. Channels are cut from the source to the fields. Low embankments are raised to stone revetments protect vulnerable sections of the bank. A modern visitor can still see the graceful curve of terracing around the oasis, and imagine how a few careful cuts can turn a flood into a feeder. This work requires more foresight than force. It requires maps in minds that know every contour. It requires keeping the promise that the gate will be guarded while farmers are in the fields, and that shared channels will be maintained in the quiet days after harvest. The archives of the family, copper and craft, burial customs also change in a way that tells us about identity in an urban world. The old habit of burying the dead beneath house floors fades. The city concentrates its graves in small cemeteries outside the inhabited mound, or on its lower slopes, usually in rock-cut chambers that can be opened and reused. Bodies are laid out with pottery and small personal items like beads, pins, and sometimes copper blades. The chambers fill over time, and the remains are rearranged to make room for the newly deceased. This practice turns the graves into family archives. It also separates daily life from the presence of the dead, suggesting a new sense of the public and the private. The house becomes a place for the living. Memory moves to the edge of the city, where it can be visited on the right days and with the right words. Copper appears more often in these layers than before. It is not common, but it is enough to change tasks that once dulled even the best flint blades. The small chisel cuts a mortise cleaner than stone. A copper awl pierces thick leather in fewer blows. A riveted knife can be sharpened many times. The ore itself did not come from the oasis. It traveled the same routes as the salt and wool. Jericho was not smelting in great volume, but it joined a system where mining valleys to the north and east sent raw metal south to cities that could pay for it, and where the markets of the lowlands could pass copper on to places like Egypt, where copper was valued and exotic. Jericho stood near the center of this web, and the web threaded its way into Jericho's new economy. All this material life depends on daily habits that are easy to miss in a chronology. We can reconstruct them from hearths and floors. In one house, a room is dedicated to plaster making and jar repair. The floor is riddled with pits where limestone was heated to make quicklime. The walls are splashed white and red from the mixing of slurry and slip. In another building, the floor shows a woven mat of reeds, the impressions left in the plaster when the bundles were used as a temporary form. These traces show a city that has turned craft into routine. Everyone knows who can fire a steady kiln. Everyone knows who builds doors that won't stick in the winter. Everyone knows the trick of rubbing the pot rims with a river pebble to harden and shine the clay before firing. It is from such routines that a reliable surplus emerges, one that can feed a labor crew for weeks when the city undertakes something large. Intellectual life unseals when we look closely at the early bronze layers of Jericho. We see households adapting intelligently to both abundance and stress. In times of plenty, the storerooms expand and diversify. There are not only jars for grain, but smaller containers for dried figs or pressed dates. In times when income is lower, floors are raised to cover old hearths and lift living spaces above damp patches. New drainage ditches are cut beneath thresholds. Courtyards are paved with river pebbles, so that mud is less of a problem during the winter rains. These are not dramatic changes. They are cautious responses to daily experience. They show a community that knows its place intimately and refuses to yield that knowledge to crisis alone. Here, there's also an intellectual life, even if texts are scarce. Seals tell part of this story. A small lump of clay, sealed with a distinctive pattern, falls from the neck of a jar or a storeroom door when the binding cord is cut. Many such lumps are preserved. Their impressions are tiny works of art, spirals and grids, stylized animals, geometric devices that speak a language of authority just as clearly as a signature on paper. Some of the seals used at Jericho came from other cities and even other regions. This fact hints at marriages between families from different towns and at agreements that extended beyond the city walls. A seal is a very portable contract. When it shows up in a place far from where it was carved, it carries with it the memory of the hands that once pressed it and the trust that was exchanged. Trade is where Jericho's urban character shows most clearly. The city is close to a substance that the rest of the region desires. That substance is salt. The Dead Sea is a cauldron where water leaves only through evaporation. Salt and other minerals from its edge could be carried out in baskets or bags. They are useful for preserving food and for certain crafts. The people of Jericho can ship salt north along the valley or west into the highlands. In return, they can receive timber from the wooded slopes, high-quality flint, and woven goods from pastoralists. When the road is safe, some goods go farther. Egyptian travelers and officials occasionally reach this corridor. Their presence sometimes shows up in an imported vessel or a stone bead that came from the land of the Nile. Jericho does not become an Egyptian outpost in this period. It becomes a place where many roads converge, and where those who manage the stores and the seals can become genuinely wealthy. Wealth has visible markers in the archaeological record. The first and simplest is the brick. A house that gets taller and larger over time belonged to a family that could muster the labor and materials to update it. The second marker is diet. The waste pits of better homes contain more meat. They also hold fish bones from the river and from the Dead Sea. The third is jewelry. Faience beads and finely drilled stone beads take time to make. When they are buried with someone, they speak of a family that could afford luxury even for the dead. All of this does not mean Jericho suddenly became a city of palaces. It means an urban hierarchy is developing, with households that take on public roles, and households that are their clients, and many people in between who thrive in good years and barely hold on in lean ones. Plastered skulls and political pragmatism, ritual life changes along with wealth and labor. The famous plastered human skulls of Jericho belong to this broad time interval. These heads are human crania that have been modeled with plaster to restore the features of the face. Shells serve as eyes. The skulls were kept in houses or in special rooms. They create a haunting experience of ancestor observation, whether they served as the focus of household worship or marked lineages in public ceremonies. They demonstrate a new investment of craft into durable objects of memory. They also affirm the city's capacity to dedicate skill to something that does not grind grain or seal jars. Civilization is not only about walls and warehouses. It is about choosing to dedicate time to the invisible bonds that connect the living to the dead. By the later part of the early Bronze Age, Jericho's urban system is sophisticated enough to interact with powerful neighbors without being absorbed. This is a delicate balance. Cities in the southern Levant learn to maintain local autonomy by controlling access to water and offering services that even larger powers found convenient to use. A caravan needs a safe place to rest and a reliable place to resupply. A garrison marching up the valley in spring needs fodder and grain. If Jericho can provide this without compromising autonomy, it becomes a node that larger powers will leave alone, as long as the services remain reliable. This is not written law. It is practical politics that leaves faint traces in the ground. The traces look like extra storage space near the gate, unlike large ovens that can bake many loaves at once. There is a darker side to this arrangement. When neighbors fight, cities on the road can be taken and retaken like pawns. A wall that slows down raiders cannot stop an army that brings ladders and time. Archaeologists read the layers of destruction that belong to this kind of conflict. A layer of ash here, a collapsed wall with fallen bricks still angled as they fell, a mass of shattered jars in a storeroom. After a sack, the survivors sweep up and rebuild. Sometimes they rebuild better. Sometimes they accept a smaller footprint and move inward toward the source. Jericho's advantage is that the oasis itself cannot be carried away. Every time the city is struck, the water waits to make the return possible. This is why there are so many layers, and why the story does not end after the first fire. The arithmetic of urban life legacy at the street level. The urban day in Jericho must have been a choreography. Picture the gate in mid-morning. Farmers enter with baskets of cucumbers, onions, and fennel. Herders guide a few animals into a pen. A porter with a shaved head and a tattooed wrist, marking his household contract, slips through with a load of reeds that will be woven into mats. Two women from a house near the spring carry a jar between them on a pole and stop often to rest. They pause to hear news from a traveler just arrived from the north, who says the bridge is down near the ford and that the river is high this year. A guard leans on a spear and counts the people passing. Inside the city, the sun throws streaks of light across the alleys, where children chase a stray dog and a cat watches from a rooftop. You do not need a written record to imagine this, because the pattern of rooms and courtyards tells you where the light falls and where the breeze goes. Archaeology is a kind of empathy directed at floors and thresholds. The end of the early Bronze story is not a neat conclusion. Across the southern Levant, many cities contract around the same time. Near the close of the 3rd millennium BCE, Jericho's decline is part of this larger pattern. The explanations multiply again. Climate shifts. Trade routes shift to favor coastal ports. New groups of nomadic pastoralists who compete for water and pasture, and who sometimes take food stores by force. earthquakes that crack the walls and make people think twice about building high. It is likely that several of these forces work together. The visible result at Jericho is sparser occupation, spread over a smaller footprint. Some public buildings fall out of use. The wall is repaired in places, but not everywhere. Districts become isolated clusters. For a time, the city lives on a lower pulse. It is not a failure. It is a pause before another kind of prosperity that belongs to the Middle Bronze Age. The knowledge Jericho gained in the early Bronze centuries does not vanish. The skills persist in families and are passed to children. The canals remain where the water still seeks the lowest path. The habits of storage and the use of seals are remembered. The way to stack bricks so the wall stands straight is taught more by gesture than by word. When the city returns to full strength in the next period, it will do so on the bones of this old city. This is the true legacy of early Bronze Jericho. It turned an oasis into a place that could forget and remember in cycles, and yet remain itself. The most important lesson of this period is simple and profound. The people at Jericho learned to turn surplus into time. A good harvest, stored in many jars, buys time for projects that do not feed you today, but will protect you tomorrow. A wall, a canal, a larger storage room, a ritual that binds families in mutual aid. Time invested this way accrues like interest. It allows the city to learn its own tricks and keep refining them. When trouble comes, as it always does, the stored time can be spent to survive a lean season. This is the arithmetic of urban life. It is as true in a city of mud brick as in one of steel and glass. Stand again at the gate in your imagination. Look beyond the wall to the fields where people are bent over the rows of barley. Listen to the city behind you. Feel the damp cold of the spring air that flows out of the oasis while the surrounding valley bakes. You are standing at a threshold of human history. The first Jericho showed that families could live year-round next to the promise of water. Early Bronze Jericho shows that families can coalesce into a working system that trades, plans, stores, and builds across generations. It is not a city in the later sense. It is something rarer. It is a city that taught itself to survive. By the time the calendar turns to the beginning of the second millennium BCE, Jericho has mastered the fundamentals of urban life. In the centuries that follow, it transitions to something more complex. The oasis becomes a fortified city-state, a Canaanite citadel with monumental defenses, rich cemeteries, and a political profile that extends far beyond the spring. The earth will remember this period with the clarity of dressed stone. When archaeologists cut through the mound, the Middle Bronze Age layers announce themselves with scale. This scale is not accidental. It is a response to a world that is both opening up and sharpening. Fortification, genius, glacis, and revetment. Let's start with the walls. Previous generations enclosed Jericho with earthworks and stone. The Middle Bronze Age builders take that idea and elevate it to a science. Imagine approaching the city from the valley floor. Long before you reach the houses, you climb a broad, sloping rampart made of packed earth. This glacis can stand as tall as a two-story building. It is angled to shed rainwater and to ensure that loose soil runs down, rather than undermining the defense. At the base of the slope stands a revetment of large stones laid in courses. The stones are heavy and rough cut, but they are chosen with care and supported by smaller chinks, so that the face of the wall rises like a dry waterfall, held by gravity and craftsmanship. Above the stone revetment stands a parapet of mud brick. From a distance, the ensemble looks like a single ring, an artificial ridge that announces the city long before the gate becomes visible. A simple lesson is embedded in the physics of the glacis. An attacker must climb a steep surface of packed earth that cannot be easily undermined. They become exposed to whatever the defenders throw. The slope channels energy from above into the ground, and the stone facing absorbs the shock of both water and men. This is engineering without iron, as clever as any calculation. The builders learned how to achieve these effects through iteration. Middle Bronze Age Jericho shows layers of rebuilding and repair where sections were supported or thickened after heavy rains. The work is cumulative. Each season adds another course or another skin to the slope. The result is a perimeter that is both a mass and a message. It says this place can mobilize labor at will and can feed them while they work. The gate marks where such a perimeter allows the outside world to pass. In this period, Jericho's main entrance is not merely a hole. The gate is an architectural structure with rooms, benches, and guard posts built into it. The approach road is directed so that carts and animals must slow down and turn. The paving is made of packed gravel and carefully laid stones. Cart ruts cut grooves that are still visible when excavations expose them to the sun. The passage through the gate is a ritual of submission to the city. Tax collectors count. Scribes or overseers press seals onto jars. Guards lean on spears where everyone can see them. The gate also sets the rhythm of the day. It opens at dawn and closes when the sun dips behind the ridge. Late caravans camp outside and watch the lights on top of the parapet until morning. Horses and chariots enter Levantine history during this period. The earliest evidence is scattered, but by the later Middle Bronze Age, the use of light chariots was a symbol of elite military power. Whether Jericho housed a chariot corps is something the earth cannot answer with certainty, but the city would have known about them and likely hosted passing detachments. The wide approach roads and open spaces inside the walls would accommodate such traffic. In a broader sense, the shift to faster wheeled warfare is one reason cities invested in massive earthwork fortifications. The glacier sand revetment system doesn't just defeat ladders, it defeats speed. It forces enemies to slow down and play the defender's game at the gate. The economics of space and pottery inside the city. The craft base becomes more specialized. The pottery repertoire of this period includes forms often interpreted as feasting ware, and forms clearly suited for mass storage. The finest pieces are thin-walled and carefully fired, yielding a ringing sound when tapped. Kiln waste found in filled pits shows that some firings failed, and that potters learned by trial and error to balance fuel, temperature, and atmosphere. Metalworking leaves small traces. Droplets of copper alloy caught in the floor plaster near the edge of a hearth, a fragment of a mold, a thin film of green corrosion on a discarded tool. Textiles also leave their shadows, loom weights, spindle whorls, and imprints of woven cloth in the damp mud where a basket once stood. These clues point to households that divided labor by skill, and to districts where certain crafts clustered. Religious life is harder to pin down to buildings, but some patterns are clear. Small shrines appear near major streets, modest rooms with benches and offering tables where people left jars of oil or food to mark vows, or give thanks. Within the homes, the old Levantine habit of placing family figurines near the hearths persists. Clay female figures with exaggerated features are common across the region, and likely represent a form of household piety that blesses fertility and protection. At a higher level, the city may have staged public rituals timed to the agricultural calendar. Processions to the gate at harvest time. Libations performed at the spring on the day the channel was opened to water the first fields. Evidence for these events is indirect, but a city that organizes labor so well will also organize meaning, and the squares and courtyards provide the necessary stages. The rhythm of the year blends civic and rural work. In late winter, when rains are still probable, the city devotes labor to the glacis and revetment, repairing washouts and restoring the steps that lead to the patrol paths on the parapet. In spring, attention shifts to the fields and to the date and fig gardens. In early summer, the threshing floors inside the walls turn golden with chaff as oxen tread circles over the sheaves, and workers toss the grain into the evening breeze to winnow it. In late summer, the stores are tallied, jars are sealed, and distribution is planned. Autumn brings the pruning and the first repairs to the channels as the water levels change. Every season has its civic tasks. The wall is not a sculpture, it is a maintenance calendar. For all this order, the Middle Bronze Age world is not stable. The very networks that enrich cities also expose them to wider shocks. A rival can raid caravans. A drought can diminish harvests across the region and force cities to spend stores. At the same time, the corridor that once carried trade can carry an army. The archaeological record at Jericho preserves more than one episode of violent destruction. In the late Middle and early Late Bronze Age layers, the signature is familiar across the Levant. Charred timbers fallen across floors, collapsed brick that still shows the imprint of wooden beams burned from the inside, a scatter of shattered vessels. In the tombs, there are disturbances where burials. When Kathleen came, she argued that the great Middle Bronze Age city met its final destruction, and the time that Egypt consolidated and moved military power back into southern Canaan, whether Jericho fell to an Egyptian campaign or to regional conflict. The end of this citadel came with fire. The end is not the whole story. A city that has trained itself to store and repair does not vanish in a single blow. After the destruction, the site shows attempts to re-establish itself. The footprint is smaller. Walls are reused rather than rebuilt to full height. Pottery shifts to forms more typical of the early Late Bronze period. Certain imports appear, including decorated vessels from Cyprus, whose painted bands and birds speak of a maritime network that now dominates. But the flood tide of the Middle Bronze Age has receded. Its energy and unmistakable voice are locked into the ramparts and the tomb shafts. The empathy of archaeology, the legacy. If you walk the streets of Jericho at the height of the Middle Bronze Age, you would feel the confidence that comes from collective competence. Children would chase each other down alleys that smelled of warm brick and pounded herbs. Porters would brace shoulder yokes beneath the weight of oil jars and bob in the same rhythm. At every turn, at the gate, merchants would wait beneath a canopy, while an overseer tallied measures and pressed a seal into a clay fastener on a sack. And if the midday sun urged you to climb the inner stairs to the wall, you could look out over the glacis and see the dust rising from the valley road, as a string of donkeys enters with sacks of salt or resin slung over their saddles. A city that can make this vision routine is a city that has mastered its landscape. The archaeological details that allow us to reconstruct this scene are not romantic. They are stubborn and physical. The angle of the ramparts that refuses to collapse when exposed to the rain again. After thousands of years in the earth, the plan of the gatehouse whose proportions make sense for a body that must swing a door and check a cartwheel. The standardized volumes of the jars that allow an overseer to think in consistent units. A newly reopened tomb where a bronze dagger lies in the crumbly dust at the feet of a child, reminding us that even grief was organized by custom. Taken together, these fragments yield a city that was many things at once. It was a strong point against raids. It was a clearinghouse for goods. It was a stage for family pride. It was an idea that the land itself could be shaped to serve a community, year after year. The chapter of Middle Bronze Age Jericho matters for reasons that go beyond the local. It shows that creating a city in the Levant was not a copy of distant models. The glacis fortification is a local solution for local soils, weather, and warfare. The rock-cut tomb is a local ritual logic for connecting the living to their lineage. The flow of scarabs and imported jars through its cemeteries signals confident participation in a regional system without surrendering identity. When later texts praise Canaanite cities for their strength and wealth, they are describing a world that Jericho helped define. Strength did not make the city immortal. In the late Middle Bronze period, the network turned against it. Power in Egypt consolidated and moved to subdue or reshape the Levant. Trade patterns shifted to favor ports that could service ships more easily than inland cities. New centers rose elsewhere. Yet, the blueprint for how to hold an oasis and how to turn water into law persisted. The walls would fall. The slope would be eroded and rebuilt in later times on different lines. The tomb shafts would be sealed. But the memory of the Canaanite citadel survives in the way the mound itself holds its shape. Even ruined, it still reads like the shoulder of a giant beneath a cloak. If you stand at the spring today and allow your mind to unspool the layers backward, you can still feel the logic of that old city. The low ground near the water is the place for homes. The steady slope just above is the place for walls. The path that skirts the mound is still the natural road through the valley. The Middle Bronze builders read these lines clearly. They turned them into the grammar of a city that could organize people, knowledge, stone, and water into a living sentence that lasted for centuries. That is what a citadel really is. It is a grammar that many voices can speak. And it still means the same thing. The ruin, the legend, and the stratigraphy stand at the foot of the Tell Mound late in the day and let the sun rake across the mound's flanks. The light catches a ruined geometry that looks almost like a frozen wave. It is the stone revetment at the base, and above it, the slope where mud brick once stood in clean rows. This is the Jericho of legend, translated into stratigraphy. In one layer, you can still follow the story that generations internalized as a lesson about horns and faith. In the next layer, the story becomes a ledger of grain, potsherds, and a timeline written in ash. The challenge is to read both accounts together, with respect for what each type of evidence can and cannot say. The biblical narrative in the book of Joshua is concise and theatrical. A walled city, a ritual circumambulation for 7 days, priests carrying the sacred ark, the trumpets, the shout, the collapse, the ban on spoils that is as much theology as law. It is an unforgettable scene. For over a century, archaeologists ascended the Tel Es Sultan Mound with this scene in mind, a trowel in one hand and a pottery topology in the other. The result is neither simple confirmation nor simple refutation. It is a conversation between text and earth that has sharpened our understanding of both. To understand why, we must go back to the layers that predate any possible conquest. The great city behind the legend belongs to the end of the Middle Bronze Age. Its builders had erected a perimeter system that was one of the best of its time. A deep stone revetment wall at the mound's base, a steep glacis of packed earth rising above it, a mud brick wall sitting on the glacis top like a crown. Inside the perimeter, the city sprawled in dense quarters with storerooms, alleys, and administrative spaces. The cemetery around the mound tells the same story of wealth and organization. Rock-cut chambers, ray burials by lineage, scarab seals, and decorated vessels that link Jericho to the wider world of Canaan and Egypt. This city met a violent end. That is not a matter of opinion. It is a layer you can touch. Archaeologists describe a burn layer that is thick and continuous, with fallen timbers charred to charcoal and brickwork that settled while still hot. The slope behind the revetment is littered with debris from the mud brick walls that collapsed outward, tumbling down the stone face. Inside, house after house, jars lay shattered across floors and shelves. In many rooms, the jars were still full when the fire came. Everywhere, there is charred barley and wheat, blackened but preserved by the very heat that brought the roofs down. The abundance of stored grain suggests two things at once. First, the catastrophe was sudden. There was no long siege where supplies were eaten away day by day. Second, it likely happened shortly after the harvest, when the bins and jars were full. These facts match the broad strokes of a conquest scene. An army that arrives right after the harvest finds full storerooms. Capture by storm and fire would leave more grain than slow starvation. The clock of history, Kenyan versus Garstang, but archaeology is a discipline of clocks. The critical question is when this destruction happened. If it can be shown to align with the period when the biblical people of Israel were moving through the highlands and down into the valley, one alignment is possible. If the destruction is older, the legend must be read as a memory set on a scene that was already ruins. In the first generation of scientific excavation at Jericho, John Garstang believed he had found the city of Joshua and dated the destruction to about 1400 BCE. His explanation relied on pottery styles and certain Egyptian objects. Garstang was a careful and pioneering field archaeologist. However, he was working at a time when pottery chronologies for the region were still being pieced together. 20 years later, Kathleen Kenyon returned with a new approach that emphasized controlled stratigraphy and close attention to the precise sequence of pottery types. Her trenches cut straight sections through the mound like pages sliced from a book. In those layered pages, she demonstrated that the great Middle Bronze city was destroyed about a century and a half earlier than Garstang thought. By her reading, the last true city on the Tell burned at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, about 15,501,512 BCE. After this, there were small settlements on the mound and reuse of tombs, but no fortified city in the period when Joshua might have approached. Kenyon's revised date gained weight from two independent lines of evidence. First, late Bronze Age pottery is virtually absent from the great city's destruction layer. The familiar imported styles that mark this period in other cities do not appear in the burn layer on the Tell. Instead, the repertoire belongs to the Middle Bronze world. Second, later radiocarbon measurements of charred grain from the destruction layer converge on a date near the end of the Middle Bronze Age. These scientific clocks agreed with the pottery clock and with a logic of regional history, in which several fortified cities met their end as political networks shifted, and Egypt put pressure on southern Canaan. Not every scholar accepted this as the final word. A notable re-evaluation by Bryant Wood argued that Kenyon's Sahamic interpretations were too strict, and that the destruction could be pushed closer to 1400 BCE. In his view, some local forms were misinterpreted, and some imported styles might have been present but missed. He emphasized the outward fall of the walls and the large amount of grain as features that aligned well with the biblical account, alongside an interpretation of Egyptian scarab sequences from nearby burials. His critique sparked a debate that is still cited in surveys of Near Eastern archaeology, because it illustrates how methods and assumptions shape conclusions. The radiocarbon dates remain a stubborn counter-argument. Short-lived plant remains, especially the charred cereal grains sealed in the destruction layer, are considered reliable anchors. When these dates cluster around the same century, it becomes difficult to shift the city's end forward by 100 years without significant additional evidence. The absence of typical late bronze imports in the fire layer also continues to sway many scholars. The debate has been useful even when it has not changed minds. It has forced everyone to be precise in definitions and generous in letting the ground speak for itself. Another line of inquiry asks not when the city fell, but how. The outward collapse of the mud brick over the stone revetment has often been noted as intriguing. It suggests the wall did not merely weather down slowly, but collapsed catastrophically, at least in sections. Fire can cause this if timbers inside the wall burn away. An earthquake could do it even more effectively. The Dead Sea Transform is a real and active fault system. Jericho is in a landscape where earthquakes are part of the long-term pattern. It is plausible that a seismic event helped bring down sections of the wall, whether as the primary cause or as a contributing factor to fire and attack. This does not disprove a human attack, but it does not prove one either. It merely reminds us that nature often plays a role in the disasters recorded by human memory. Symbol and memory, a literary choice, if we return to the biblical account. With this multi-layered understanding, certain features light up with fresh context. The instruction to devote the city to destruction rather than spoil would fit a scene where grain is left to burn and jars to shatter. The insistence that the walls fell flat is a poetic force that may take its metaphor from the very literal physics of brickwork sliding down a steep surface. The mention of a house built into the wall where a woman named Rahab sheltered spies is consistent with the reality that cities often had dwellings built close to, or even anchored into, the perimeter. None of these resonances proves identity between the archaeological layer and the narrative. They show how stories absorb the physical logic of real places. The question of occupation at the right time remains. If we follow the common reconstruction in which the Exodus and subsequent Highland group movements happened in the 13th century BCE, then Jericho at Tel Es Sultan offers little as a target. The mound shows limited reuse of the cemetery and some ephemeral structures, but no fortified city with operating gates and a ring of houses. The legendary scene would then be set upon memory and geography, rather than a specifically occupied city. If we adopt an earlier chronology for the Israelites' arrival in the land one, that places the conquest around 1400 BCE, a small window opens. in which Garstang's original intuition might find support. That window narrows again when the radiocarbon and ceramic clocks are placed side by side. Most historians today therefore conclude that the dramatic destruction the mound remembers belongs to the end of the Middle Bronze Age world, and that the later narrative relies upon these ruins as a stage. Even if the actors belong to a later time, there is another way to read the relationship between text and tell. Rather than tying the story to a single event of destruction, we can view Jericho as a symbol of the idea of the first step into the Promised Land. Jericho is the lowest city on earth in elevation and one of the earliest to build walls and towers. It stands where the desert and the sown meet. Clashing with it first in the narrative of possession is a literary choice that feels right, regardless of whether the gates were manned in that exact year. When the story says the first barrier fell, it is choosing a place that taught the region the very art of wall building. This is not dismissing history. It is recognizing that history and meaning are often intertwined. What archaeology gives us, meanwhile, is vivid in its own right. We can walk the room where the last Middle Bronze Age city of Jericho burned, and scoop up a handful of charred barley grains from a corner where a jar shattered. When the roof came down, we can trace the winding face of the stone revetment and imagine the line of a ladder, pitched against the mud brick wall above it, while defenders shouted at men scrambling up with shields. We can stand in the mouth of a rock-cut tomb and feel the cool air of the space, where a family rearranged bones to make room for one more person when their time came. We can pick up a small lump of clay with a scarab seal impression and consider the day. An overseer sealed a storeroom door, pressed the seal into the damp clay with a practiced twist, and walked away, unaware that his neat mark would harden into evidence for future scholars. Then the curtain comes down after the fire. The tell is quiet for a long time. The cemetery is not wholly abandoned. Some tombs continue to receive burials, and a few new intimates appear with objects that belong to the late Bronze world. On the mound itself, there are hearths and small structures, but nothing resembling the city that came before. Travelers still follow the valley. They may have seen the oasis and perhaps camped near the spring. The city is not there to extract a toll or receive guests with bread and dates. When the Iron Age arrives centuries later, a modest settlement re-emerges on the mound. By then, the old city walls will be an ancient memory crumbling in the sun. The story of Joshua at Jericho, therefore, lives in a productive tension with the ground. The text carries theological purpose and communal memory. The mound carries the physics of brick, heat, and time. They are not enemies. Each corrects the extremes of the other. The ground checks the abrupt desire to tie every verse to a trench. The text checks the dry habit of reducing the city to a list of sherds and measurements. Together, they allow us to see ancient Jericho with a depth neither can achieve alone. The geography of memory, pause, and relocation. If we return one more time to that late afternoon light on the revetment, the scene feels less like a puzzle to be solved and more like an honest landscape through which multiple stories pass. The Neolithic tower that taught people to organize, the Canaanite citadel that turned earth into law, the biblical lesson that placed courage and obedience at the start of the journey, the sequence of excavations that taught archaeology to argue with evidence. All of it is in one place where the spring insists on flowing. That persistence is the oldest plot point in the Jericho narrative. That is why there was always something to find and something to say here. This return to small-scale occupation raises another question. Where exactly did later people build their homes in the Jericho landscape, when they did not want to live atop layers of ruin? The answer that emerges as history progresses is that settlement shifted to nearby ground, with better access to the spring and with less rubble to contend with. The tell was still a landmark, but it was not the only option. Natural terraces around the oasis could accommodate new farms and alleyways, without the heavy labor of leveling the mound. When we reach the classical ages, the great building projects do not rise on the old tell. They rise adjacent to the spring, on fresh ground. The seeds of this shift are already present in the centuries after the fire. Even if the grand palaces and gardens are still far in the future, written records add their sparse lines to this chapter. The Late Bronze Age brought a cache of letters between Canaanite rulers and the Egyptian court, written in Akkadian on clay tablets. These Amarna letters mention many cities in turmoil. The correspondence is full of pleas for archers and protests about neighbors, and complaints about Habaru raiders. Jericho is not an active voice in this chorus. Its name does not appear with the regularity of places like Megiddo, Shechem, or Hazor. Silence in a diplomatic archive is not proof of absence, but it matches the archaeological picture of a site that no longer held a seat at the regional table. The Hebrew Bible continues to remember Jericho, but the memory shifts from the fortress on the mount to the oasis as a region. It is called the City of Palms. It becomes a directional marker in the stories of the judges and kings. This is what geography does to memory. When the citadel is gone, the persistent feature takes its place in the language. People do not forget the spring. They rename the space around it to fit the life it still provides. An empty citadel can still cast a long shadow in a story if the road passes by it. The physical mound is useful as a lookout and as a source of stacked stone. The social city lives nearby, where the water is most accessible. There is a quieter change worth noticing in how the ground accumulates. In a thriving city, every windy storm is followed by sweeping and disposal. Refuse goes to dumps outside the walls or into intentional fills beneath new floors. In a sparsely settled site, the wind claims the alleys. Dust moves without being arrested by a broom. Light sand and silt settle in corners, then crust over in the next rain, then trap the next layer. After a decade of this pattern, a century later, a doorway is a line of memory in a wall that now rises only knee-high. Archaeologists have a term for the fine, loose layers that drift into abandoned spaces, colluvium and aeolian wash. This is geology making pages over a book no one bothers to read. Jericho's quiet centuries are recorded in just such pages. The cemetery holds the clearest thread through this pause. Some family tombs remain in use for generations after the last city burned. New offerings in late Bronze and early Iron Age styles appear among the older bones. Often, they are not luxurious by the standards of the earlier Middle Bronze chambers. It is a jar or two, a bowl, a personal item that meant much to the living and was given in farewell. This continuity is significant in a way not always apparent at first glance. It means that families held a thread of identity even as the built city fell apart. Maintaining tombs requires memory. Memory requires gatherings. The oasis was still a gathering place. Erosion and stone robbing changed the mound's profile during these centuries in ways that complicate our reading today. When a city is abandoned or only lightly settled, people often take bricks from old walls to build new structures. Mud brick is a valuable resource when you need to patch a roof or build a one-room shelter. Every missing course flattens the tell slightly. Rain then follows new paths across the interrupted facades. The smooth planes that a careful builder once plastered and maintained become uneven steps. In a modern trench, these processes cause confusion for anyone expecting intact walls everywhere. The Middle Bronze Age ramparts are still visible because they were built of stone and massive earth. Many later walls are ghosts. Absence is not proof that no one was building. It is the cumulative effect of reuse and weather across long centuries. When there were no budgets for major repairs, the city of gardens Hasmoneans and Harrod, what was the daily life of those who remained? Small gardens around the spring, small flocks that grazed the low hills and drank from canals cut from the source. A pattern of seasonal movement, modest exchange with neighbors. A pot of date syrup boiled down and traded for a tool repair. A skin of water left for a traveler in exchange for news. Children who climbed the old rampart and learned to call the slopes by names their grandparents used, pointing out landmarks. A life where the ancient city was a presence, not a place you walk to every day. From a historian's perspective, it's tempting to call this a gap before the next big chapter, which can obscure the real work communities do between bursts of monumental building. The people of this period kept the canals open. They kept the ponds trimmed and productive. They kept burial customs alive. They preserved the recipes for plaster, bread, and the simple jar forms that reappeared in later periods with minor adjustments. They remembered the paths that would matter when rulers with larger resources returned, and wanted to fashion the oasis into a garden worthy of a court. We must give the final word of this section to the landscape itself. Stand at the base of the tell and turn toward the spring. The Judean hills stand dark to the west. To the east, the valley opens to the river and the Dead Sea. The air is dry and warm even in winter. You can hear the water if you listen. You can also hear a complete nothing when the wind stills. This is the sound of an empty citadel after the fire has been extinguished. It is not a tragic silence. It is a silence of expectation. The road remains. The palms do what palms have always done. People come and go. They leave small signatures in the mud that are easy to miss unless you know where to look. Later centuries would look, and they would find enough to remind them that the spring never stopped being generous. Even while the man slept, walk down from the old tell toward the spring, and you feel history change under your feet. The city that once huddled on the mound, with its ramparts and ruined revetments, gives way to a broad, green basin where water moves easily, and the air feels a degree softer than the surrounding area. This is where Jericho reinvented itself in the Hellenistic and early Roman eras. The citadel became a garden city. Kings and high priests moved their winter quarters here, choosing not to look at walls, but to live among palm trees and water stairs, tiled baths, and shaded courtyards. The landscape began to look like a restrained promise. The word palace did not mean a lonely throne in a stone hall. It meant a complex organism of gardens, pools, aqueducts, kitchens, storerooms, porticos, and pleasure rooms that ran on water, labor, and craft. Let's start with the move itself. The center of gravity slipped from the old tell to the low mounds to the southwest, along the Wadi Kelt, a ravine that brings winter water from the highlands to the oasis. The Arabic name, Tulul Abu al-Alaik, means little hills of the grapevines, and the name fits. It is here that the Hasmonean rulers of Judea chose to build country residences in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. The choice was practical and symbolic at once. Practical because there was open land for spacious plans and close enough to the spring for easy water capture. Symbolic because a new dynasty wanted to move away from the broken silhouette of old cities and show that it could create a paradise out of the bare floodplain. Archaeology has given us the bones of these first palaces. Excavations, led by a Hudnetzer and others, have traced long halls with plastered floors, colonnaded courtyards that breathed in the evening, and a lacework of canals and pools that turned the edge of the desert into a controlled garden. One trick emerges repeatedly. Water is delivered at a high point, split into shallow, stone-lined channels, and led past rooms and open courtyards, so it can be seen and heard while doing useful work. It fills a cistern for animals. It cools the air by sliding in the shade. It feeds a sunken garden where trees root below the wind level and draw heat back into the cool night. It moves from use to use and then drops into a larger pool where silt settles before the next task. The palace is a hydrological diagram you can walk on. Herod, Balsam, and the architecture of power. The Hasmonean builders left the clearest footprints in their ritual structures. Alongside banqueting halls and audience rooms, they built multiple stepped immersion pools. These mikvoth are deep enough to cover a standing person, lined with fine plaster, and fed with clean water that could be drained and refilled. They show a court that took the laws of purity seriously, even while adopting some Mediterranean elements of luxury. In nearby storerooms, amphorae appear among the simpler local jars. This mix tells the story of a court that could both receive foreign envoys and maintain its own customs without hesitation. The garden was an economic engine as much as a setting. Jericho's microclimate fostered groves of date palms and thickets of balsam. Dates fed people and animals and sweetened food in a world without cane sugar. Balsam, a resin tapped from shrubs that grew here, supplied a perfume and the medicinal oil that was prized across the ancient Mediterranean. Writers could not resist its fame. The resin features in lists of royal goods. The shrubs are mentioned as a monopoly guarded by the court. The groves were not natural thickets anyone could encroach upon. They were managed assets with overseers, guards, and skilled laborers who know how to score the bark and collect the sap without killing the plant. The Hasmoneans understood what they had. They turned the oasis into a royal estate that could pay soldiers and buy friends. History then did what it always does. It brought new players into the garden. In the last generation of the Hasmoneans, the high priest Aristobulus was invited to bathe at Jericho. He never came out of the water alive. His death by drowning in a palace pool became a scandal that attached itself to the name of Herod, the Idumean aristocrat whose ascent would change the map of Judea. The story matters not just for the palace intrigue, but for what it tells us about the setting. That there were pools large enough for swimming is certain. That the palace company of priests and nobility could move from feasting to bathing without leaving the compound shows how completely the palace absorbed daily life. Herod the Great learned from the Hasmoneans and then surpassed them. Jericho became one of his favorite winter capitals. He didn't just refurbish the old rooms. He built a new palace in phases that can still be traced. Herod's first palace rose near the earlier complex and introduced visitors to a new vocabulary of power. Thick walls framed an open peristyle court. Rooms were arranged on axial lines that allowed a guest to admire and be impressed before they had time to look down. Bath complexes followed the Roman sequence. Hot, warm, and cold rooms, with hypercus floor heating in the hot room, vaulted spaces to hold steam, and mosaic floors that could stand up to repeated wetting. Walls were covered with frescoes that reproduced marble and architectural vistas in paint. This was a home that exhibited itself daily, even when there was no waiting delegation at the gate. Nature reminded the king where he lived. In 31 BCE, a major earthquake shook the Jordan Valley. It toppled walls, broke aqueducts, and likely damaged Herod's first palace. The recovery at Jericho was swift because the royal treasury was behind the plan. Herod did not abandon the place. He built again and bigger, using the lessons the earthquake taught. A second and then a third palace rose along the banks of the Wadi Kelt. Each is sited slightly differently to capitalize on the slope and the view. One plan was bridged over the ravine, so the palace literally joined its two halves across the water. This bold arrangement made the stream part of the architecture. It is a genuine river when winter rains fall. To occupy both banks at once is to say the court controls not just the land but the flow. The new constructions expanded the scale of the water features. Pools became large enough that modern visitors compare them to public baths. Some were formal rectangles with stairs descending in broad flights on all four sides. Others were bathing pools connected by channels that allowed water to move sequentially through the rooms. Fresh water in the middle of a semi-desert was not merely a pleasure. It was a climatic device. A large pool cooled the air as it evaporated, and the vapor-heavy air drifted beneath the porticos where people rested. A palace tuned this way is an instrument played by winter and spring. Gardens as economic engine, the gardens did more than cool and scent the air. They yielded harvests of dates that were carted through service gates, spread on sunning grounds to dry, and moved into storerooms where jars waited to be filled. The balsam thickets yielded a more valuable product that was controlled directly by royal agents. The court managed labor with the same caution it gave to feasting. Overseers measured out rations. Scribes noted quantities and destinations on clay and wooden tacks. Guards watched the gates. There is a reason why ancient writers wrote that Jericho's revenues were coveted by queens and generals. Cleopatra received the royal estates of Jericho as a gift from Mark Antony during the final storms of the Roman Republic, and then leased them back to Herod for a stiff fee. After the battle that made Augustus master of the Mediterranean, the estates reverted to Herod. The garden remained central to larger politics. Herod's Jericho was not just a farm with fancy rooms. It was a node in a system of roads and festivals. The road to Jerusalem climbs from the oasis across a succession of ridges. The ascent is steep, and strong travelers could make it in a day. Caravans and courtiers needed staging posts. Jericho provided this with inns and barracks that doubled as warehouses. Herod added a hippodrome on the estate grounds, a track where horses and chariots could demonstrate speed and where the court could stage public performances. In the same landscape, a theatre was offered, a place where a large audience could sit in rows under the winter sun. These entertainments were not secondary. They were the way a ruler presented himself as the author of order and pleasure in a world that had recently been rocked by civil wars. The archaeological traces of this brilliance are surprisingly human. A course of chiseled, rusticated blocks that carry the polished echo of many hands. A threshold worn by years of sand and sandals. Tesserae of a mosaic that fell from its bedding and clustered on the floor like a tiny rock slide. Fragments of painted wall plaster that record as they crumble. A broken ring from a finger worn by someone who swept through rooms now open to the sky. No one saw these things as future evidence. They were just the parts of a house that worked. The fact that they still speak is the best measure of how thoroughly water and stone held the court together. Herod himself had reasons to love this city. Jericho promised relief from the cold winds of the highlands. The air in the oasis is soft and remedial in winter. When illness gripped him near the end of his life, he came here, and then traveled to the hot springs across the valley at Calaho, where mineral waters rise near the Dead Sea. He died soon after returning to Jericho. The funeral procession carried him up the road to Herodium, the fortress tomb he erected on a conical hill south of Jerusalem. That long, final climb from the Palms to the high country is one of those scenes that always belong to this city. A ruler might love the green basin, but the kingdom was held on the ridges. The road between the two is a biography of the ruler in miniature. Hydraulic prosperity after Herod. The gardens did not disappear. The administration changed. The estate passed to his son Archelaus for a short time, then to direct Roman control. As Archelaus was deposed, governors and officials cycled through, and the winter residents remained a prize of service. The pattern of planting and pruning continued because the craft and the channels persisted. Palace ruins were repaired or repurposed, less magnificent than the first decades, but still able to serve the basic need that made the place valuable. The river did not forget its banks. Simple numbers help define the scale of the whole system. A mature date palm can yield dozens of kilograms of fruit in a season. A grove of thousands of trees could feed local needs and create a surplus that moved on the valley roads. The balsam yield is smaller but far more valuable. A small amphora of the resin could be worth the price of a wagon of grain. Jericho's prosperity, therefore, stemmed from a deliberate diversification. Grain grew where it was safe to sow and harvest. Gardens yielded fruits and vegetables. Ponds provided food and shade. Balsam provided luxury. The palace presided over it all as a clearinghouse and a guarantor. The most delightful detail of the palace landscape is how it staged daily life. As a series of framed views, a visitor moved from the glare of the outer courtyard through a shaded portico into a space where water moved in a narrow channel along the polished curb. Ahead, the triclinium, or dining room, opened up, with couches arranged on three sides so guests could recline and converse while servants circulated. To one side, the bath complex glowed like a promise. Down a stair, a sunken garden lay below the level where the wind stilled and where citrus trees could thrive. Around the corner ran a service passage to the kitchens, where the fires never died. The architecture choreographed mood even more than movement. The garden city was a theatre kind to its actors. None of this would survive even a few seasons without constant attention. The aqueducts that brought water from the spring and from the Wadi Kelt had to be cleared of silt. After every winter storm, their channels needed to be replastered with lime stucco when hairline cracks appeared. The pools needed scrubbing and occasional sealing with a fresh layer of mortar. The trees required pruning and protection from pests. The place was a calendar in stone and wood. Maintenance was not a burden imposed on weary workers by a demanding court. It was the essence of the court's continued existence. The most serious ritual in Jericho was the annual choice to keep the water flowing smoothly. The contrast with the old tell could not be sharper. The tell is a memory of defense and sudden disaster. imprinted in layers of brick and ash. The palace quarter at Jericho is a memory of continuity, built around water. The shift from one to the other did not mean that warfare was over. The region always had its storms. It meant that in this period, a dynasty could afford to demonstrate control by managing pleasure as well as danger. To say the city was a garden is not to soften its history. It is to name the technology that made power feel natural. If you stand in the palace ruins today on a quiet winter afternoon, you can still collect this experience from the remnants. The sun touches a wall covered in smooth white plaster that once caught it like a pool. The air carries the faint sweet smell of dates and dust. Down the slope, an aqueduct line is visible as a low embankment that refuses to erode like the ground next to it. Children run on it because it is smooth and level, which is almost certainly what children did when Herod walked here. The garden city has not entirely vanished. Enough of its grammar remains that a visitor can still read. Jericho as an axis in new memory. The garden city that Herod perfected did not end with him. It changed costumes as empires changed flags, and it learned to speak the languages of faith that arrived on the roads. The palm groves and the aqueducts kept their quiet logic. Administrators came and went. What deepened was the sense that Jericho was an axis between the desert and the highlands, and between the sacred and the mundane. You can trace this shift in how stories attach themselves to the place, and how buildings gather the faithful. Let's begin with Roman power. After Herod, the oasis Jericho lay in an area the Roman administrators called a toparchy, a cluster of villages and fields that paid tax in kind and coin. An official with a taste for order could stand in the shade and watch the caravans count their way in. Salt and bitumen from the Dead Sea passed through, along with the dates and balsam that were valued far beyond the valley. The old Hasmonean palaces and the newer Herodian wings were repaired and repurposed, and a small garrison guarded the gate of the road to Jerusalem. The road itself climbed steeply from the oasis in a series of switchbacks and terraces. Milestones and small forts guarded it. A traveler could pass through 3 climates in a single day, leaving the warm air and citrus for a wind that smelled of rock and pine as the ridge approached. The empire brought more than just officials. It brought new audiences and new texts. The Gospels anchor episodes here that layered the oasis with a particular kind of memory. The story of Zacchaeus, the tax collector climbing a sycamore tree to see the traveling teacher who entered Jericho, is simple and vivid. It anchors a tree and the road in consciousness. Another scene follows the road up toward Jerusalem and tells of a traveler attacked by robbers and aided by a stranger others would have ignored. The valley and the wadis are perfect for this parable. The ravines cut by winter torrents stretch like open wounds toward the city on the hills. Anyone who walks there understands immediately why a story of kindness chose that ascent as its stage. Archaeology adds a quieter counterpoint to these texts. Synagogues appear in and around the oasis in the late Roman and early Byzantine centuries, where both Judaism and Christianity took deep root in the region. One synagogue at Jericho is remembered for a mosaic floor that survived long after its roof collapsed. The floor carries a central panel with a menorah surrounded by ritual objects, and an inscription that calls for peace over Israel. Another synagogue at nearby Narration shows a mosaic carpet with animals, fruits, and geometric panels, and a dedicatory text that names the donors and asks them a good life. Such mosaics are not theological treatises. They are records of local pride and the community that could gather the resources to lay colored stone in durable patterns. They show an oasis where artisans could create beauty on demand, and where patrons wanted that beauty underfoot. Christian communities grew along the same lines. Pilgrims came to the Jordan River and to the memories anchored at the edge of the desert. The river bends near Jericho and creates a natural approach to the water that fueled a new ritual life. Baptism at the spot where the river slows and widens became a magnet for travelers from many lands. They left small souvenirs and recorded their visits in lists and itineraries. The Madaba map, a 6th century floor mosaic in a church east of the Jordan, shows Jericho as a cluster of red roof buildings among palm trees. Labeled and easily recognizable, it is a charming detail, and it reminds us that in late antiquity, the oasis had its own cartographic identity. If you were a pilgrim or a merchant and saw this map, you could point to Jericho and know what awaited you there. The theater of obedience, monasteries in the cliffs, hermits, and monks claimed the cliffs of the Wadi Kelt as their own theater of devotion. The rock face above the stream contains caves and ledges that invited solitude. In the 5th and 6th centuries, dedicated people carved cells and chapels into these walls and created a ladder of prayer above the running water. The monastery, later known as St. George of Koziba, began as a cluster of such cells. It grew into a hanging complex that seems to defy gravity. Paths clinging to the cliff allow a human chain to carry bread and oil up to the refectory, and to lower the dead gently down to the stream when it is time to bury them in the cool earth. The entire complex is a meditation on the boundary between water and rock, between voice and silence. To stand on one of its balconies and look across the wadi is to understand how a landscape can turn labor into devotion. Another center of Christian memory rises above the oasis on a limestone ridge to the northwest. Tradition identifies this height as the place where Jesus fasted and encountered the temptations. The Greek name for the peak, recorded in later centuries, is a title that matches the view. The ridge feels like a lookout over the world. A monastery clings there, too. Built in stages over centuries, the rooms seem to grow out of the rock itself. Steps cut into the cliff edge lead to chapels where candles mark the stone with smoke. The effect is again the garden city turned inward, where Herod used water to display pleasure and power. The monks used space and silence to display renunciation. Both projects required the mind of an engineer and a community that obeyed rules. Roman authority became Byzantine authority as the empire pivoted eastward in its political center and in its faith. Administrative names changed, and new churches rose near the synagogues that continued to serve their communities. The oasis continued to feed both. The palace complexes gradually fell into partial disrepair and were quarried for stone when new public buildings were needed. Some sections continued to serve as official residences for governors, who preferred the winter among the palms to the winter in the highland city. Taxes still flowed in the form of grain, dried dates, and cash that paid soldiers and repaired bridges after storms. Inscriptions of the period record donors to churches and donors to synagogues, banally, but preciously, proving that daily religious life could proceed side by side without the drama that later polemics sometimes demand. The road to Jerusalem was still the artery that made and broke seasons. Passover in the highland city could draw tens of thousands of people in the earlier centuries. The pilgrimage festivals in the Christian era also filled the road. Jericho benefited as a prime rest stop and water buying point. This also made the oasis vulnerable when politics turned violent during the revolt against Rome. In the 1st century, Roman forces swept the valley and captured Jericho as part of their strategy to isolate Jerusalem. The Jewish historian Josephus gives a grim account of the fighting and flight in the area. The details are colored by rhetoric and his own complex position, but the contour of the disruption is clear. When war comes to a place like this, the damage reads like a ledger of broken irrigation, trampled gardens, and burned storerooms, rather than toppled city walls. Water and groves can recover, but people deliberate carefully about where they want to rebuild after seeing soldiers at their gates. The pattern of disruption and neglect. The earthquakes that periodically shake the Jordan Valley added their own punctuation. A powerful earthquake in the early 4th century damaged buildings across the region, and another in the late 4th century shattered many of the churches and synagogues that had just been built. Jericho did not escape these blows. You can trace the pattern in the layers of rebuilding and in how mosaics shift and crack beneath new floors. A late antique mosaic often lies like a page beneath a later one. Both are beautiful. Both are still readable in parts. The work of different generations who shared the same room and the same address. without ever meeting. Natural forces and human purpose wrote alternate chapters in the same house. Despite all these shocks, the late Roman and Byzantine centuries in Jericho feel like a long afternoon of steady tending. The aqueducts needed annual attention. The pools needed frequent replastering. The groves required pruning on a strict schedule and replacement when a palm aged out. The men and women who worked as gardeners, masons, plasterers, cooks, and gatekeepers passed skills from neighbor to neighbor. A visitor could arrive in the morning in the dry wind from the desert, and by noon, feel the air drop to something soft near a shaded courtyard where water murmured in channels. The courts of bishops and local rulers gathered in cooler rooms that faced the pools. Paperwork was done with a view of the gardens. Jericho taught power to dress quietly. Strangers from far lands left records of what they saw. The pilgrim of Bordeaux in the 4th century passed the road from Jerusalem and noted the holy sites. With the brevity of a man making a list for a friend, later travelers were more expansive. They wrote of the ponds and the Jordan, of the monasteries that clung to the cliffs, of the inns where they met monks who served bread and olives and told them where to go next. These texts sound modern in their specificity. You can follow their footsteps today, across the same light on the same stones. Even where a building has shifted or a name has migrated, the pattern of approach has a memory that is hard to erase. Another institution deserves mention because it survived every army that climbed this road. Hospitality in Jericho became a craft. Caravanserais and pilgrim houses lined the approaches to the main spring. Some were simple courtyards with rooms on 3 sides and a gate that could be locked at sunset. Others were elaborate inns attached to a monastery or synagogue, where the duties of welcome were a matter of rule as well as a matter of business. The people who ran these houses learned the needs of entire seasons. They stocked barley for the animals. They bought bales of reeds to repair the sleeping mats. They kept lamps and oil in bulk. They knew when the road was safe and when it was not. Their quiet knowledge was how empire felt in a single room. This empire shifted again when Sasanian armies entered the Levant in the early 7th century. In a year Christians remember for the loss of holy places and the wounding of monasteries and churches. Jericho and its valley felt the arrival of new masters and the departure of old patrons. The Persian occupation was brief by the measure of the oasis. It inflicted damage that monks and villagers had to repair after Byzantine control briefly returned. The exhaustion of this conflict was just beginning to set in, when another force arrived from the south and east, speaking the language of the desert and carrying a new set of promises about community and law. The crossroads of the Islamic era, the Caliph's palace, the profile of late antique Jericho. At that moment is a palimpsest parchment where old writing has been scraped away. The palaces begun in Hasmonean times and brought to splendor by Herod still stood with walls where swallows nested. The aqueducts still crossed the wadi on low arches. The synagogues retained their mosaic floors like carpets rolled out for guests who paused from business to sit and talk. The monasteries clung to the cliffs where the sound of the stream was loudest after the rain. The inns kept bread ready for strangers. The garden was still a machine for water, shade, and sweetness. The faiths that walked its roads did not cancel each other out. They shared the same air and left words in Greek, Aramaic, and Latin on stones that are now housed in museums. The place had become an archive of devotion. Stand at the spring today and listen, and you can still hear this layering history. A bell from the monastery up the wadi, a call to prayer from the modern city beyond the groves, the braking of a bus on the road that leads to the ridge, a guide telling a small group that this is where a tax collector climbed a tree to see better, someone reading a dedication from a mosaic to a friend who wanted proof that the menorah was truly there in stone. The voices are different. The setting is the same. Empires pass. Faiths settle. The water keeps moving. Stand at the spring of Tel Es Sultan, and the past begins to pile up before you like books left open to the wind. A traveler today can drink from the same reliable source that beckoned the Natufian foragers to linger and drew the early farmers to build floors of white plaster. Yet, The story of Jericho after late antiquity is not merely a retelling of old beginnings. It is a chronicle of how a place continues to reinvent itself across multiple regimes, how memory and science sometimes argue and sometimes agree, and how the quiet persistence of water keeps cities alive even when walls fall and palaces fade. After the armies of the early 7th century passed through the Levant, Jericho learned new names and new rhythms. In the first centuries of Islamic rule, the oasis featured in Arab geographies as being praised for its bananas and dates, for the balsam shrubs that yielded a valuable perfume, and for the sweet water that tasted as if it had been filtered through gardens. Officials at the courts in Damascus and later Jerusalem tallied the groves and the canals alongside the households. They understood that Jericho was more than just a beautiful place to winter. It was an agricultural engine that ran on careful hydrology. The Umayyad era left one of the clearest physical marks of this confidence north of the spring, at a site called Khirbet al-Mafiyah. There, in the 8th century, a princely residence rose, square in plan with a monumental gateway. The halls were lined with carved stucco, and the bath complex had floors covered in intricate mosaic work. The most famous panel shows a tree flanked by 2 gazelles and a hunting beast. It is a scene that turns the geometry of the garden into a parable of order and peril. Whether the complex was started for Caliph Hisham or his nephew Walid, it makes one point certain. Rulers of this period used architecture to say that the edge of the desert could be tamed and made delightful. This confidence did not make the oasis immune to shocks. Earthquakes were always a part of the Jordan Valley. One major event in the mid-8th century devastated buildings from Galilee to the lower valley. The palace at Khirbet al-Mafiyah shows a break in its history around the time when walls fell, and rooms were left unfinished or abandoned, or also returned again and again. Crusader, Ayyubid, and Mamluk campaigns left their marks in taxes and in damage. Yet, even in moments when palaces sagged and monasteries retreated behind repaired doors, Jericho's green belt endured. Sugar mills operated along the Wadi in the later medieval centuries. The landscape of stories, the synthesis of eras, if we return once more to that late afternoon light. On the revetment, the scene feels less like a puzzle to be solved and more like an honest landscape, across which several stories pass. The Neolithic tower that taught people to organize, the Canaanite citadel that turned ground into law, the biblical lesson that placed courage and obedience at the start of the path, the sequence of excavation that taught archaeology to argue with evidence. All of it is in one spot where the spring insists on flowing. This persistence is the oldest plot point in the Jericho narrative. That is why there has always been something to find and something to say here. This return to small-scale settlement raises another question. Where exactly did later people build their homes in the Jericho landscape, when they didn't want to live on top of the layers of ruin? The answer that emerges as the story develops is that the settlement shifted to nearby land, with better access to the spring and with less rubble to contend with. The tell was still a landmark, but it was not the only option. Natural terraces around the oasis could accommodate new farms and alleys, without the heavy labor of leveling the mound. When we reach the classical ages, the great building projects do not rise on the old mound. They rise adjacent to the spring, on fresh ground. The seeds of this shift are already present in the centuries after the fire. Even if large palaces and gardens are still far in the future, written records add their sparse lines to this chapter. The late Bronze Age brought a cache of letters between Canaanite rulers and the Egyptian court, written in Akkadian on clay tablets. These Amarna letters mention many cities in turmoil. The correspondence is full of pleas for archers and protests about neighbors, and complaints about Habiru brigands. Jericho is not an actor in this chorus. Its name does not appear with the regularity of places like Megiddo or Shechem or Hazor. Silence in a diplomatic archive is not proof of absence, but it fits the archaeological picture of a site that no longer commanded a seat at the regional table. The Hebrew Bible continues to remember Jericho, but the memory shifts from the fortress on the mount to the oasis as a region. It is called the City of Palm Trees, It becomes a directional marker in the stories of the judges and the kings. This is what geography does to memory. When the citadel is gone, the persistent feature takes its place in the language. People do not forget the spring. They rename the space around it to fit the life it still provides. An empty citadel can still cast a long shadow in a story if the road goes past it. The physical mound is useful as a lookout and as a source of stacked stone. The social city lives nearby, where the water is most accessible. The pages of geology, colluvium and forgetting, there is a quieter change, worth noticing, in how the ground accumulates. In a thriving city, every windstorm is followed by sweeping and disposal. Debris goes into dumps outside the walls or into deliberate fills beneath new floors. In an undersettled site, the wind reclaims the alleys. Dust moves without being arrested by a broom. Light sand and silt settle into corners, then crust over in the next rain, then trap the next layer. After a decade of this pattern, a courtyard will look like it was deliberately filled. After a century, a doorway is a line of memory in a wall that now only rises knee-high. Archaeologists have a term for the fine, loose layers that drift into abandoned spaces, colluvium and aeolian wash. This is geology making pages over a book no one is bothering to read. Jericho's quiet centuries are recorded in just such pages. The cemetery holds the clearest thread through this pause. Some family tombs remain in use for generations after the last city burned. New offerings in late Bronze and early Iron Age styles appear among the older bones. Often, they are not luxurious by the standards of the earlier Middle Bronze chambers. They are one or two jars, a bowl, a personal item that meant much to the living and was given in farewell. This continuity is a significant point that is not always visible at first glance. It means that families held a thread of identity, even as the built city fell apart. Erosion and stone robbing changed the profile of the mound during these centuries in ways that complicate our reading today. When a city is abandoned or only lightly settled, people often take bricks from old walls to build new structures. Mud brick is a valuable resource when you need to patch a roof or build a single-room shelter. Every missing course flattens the tell slightly. Rain then follows new paths over the interrupted facings. The level planes that a careful builder once plastered and maintained become uneven steps. In a modern trench, these processes cause confusion for anyone expecting intact walls everywhere. The Middle Bronze ramparts are still visible because they were built of stone and massive earth. Many later walls are ghosts. Absence is not proof that no one built. It is the cumulative effect of reuse and weather across the long centuries. When there were no budgets for major repairs, what was the daily life of those who remained? Small gardens around the spring, small flocks that grazed the low hills and drank from channels cut from the source, a pattern of seasonal movement between the oasis and outlying plots that needed lookouts more than walls, modest exchange with neighbors, a pot of date syrup boiled down and traded for a tool repair, a water skin left for a traveler in exchange for news. Children climbing the old ramparts and learning to name the slopes, with the names their grandparents used, pointing at the landmarks. A life where the ancient city was a presence, not a place you went to every day. From a historian's perspective, it is tempting to call this a gap before the next big chapter, which can obscure the real work communities do between bursts of monumental construction. The people of this period kept the channels open. They kept the ponds pruned and productive. They kept the burial customs alive. They preserved the recipes for plaster, bread, and simple jar forms that reappear in later periods with little change. They remembered the pathways that would matter when rulers with larger resources returned, and wanted to engineer the oasis into a garden fit for a court. We must give the final word of this section to the landscape itself. Stand at the base of the tell and face the spring. The Judean hills stand dark to the west. To the east, the valley opens to the river and the Dead Sea. The air is dry and warm even in winter. You can hear the water if you listen. You can also hear a complete nothing when the wind stills. That is the sound of an empty citadel after the fire has faded. It is not a tragic silence. It is the silence of expectation. The road remains. The palm trees do what palm trees have always done. People come and go. They leave small signatures in the mud that are easy to miss unless you know where to look. Later centuries would look, and they would find enough to remind them that the spring never stopped being generous. Even when the mound slept, caliphs, sugar, and the new economy walked down from the old tell toward the spring, and you feel history shift beneath your feet. The city that once huddled on the mound with its earthworks and ruined revetments gives way to a broad green basin where water moves easily, and the air feels a degree softer than the surrounding terrain. This is where Jericho reinvented itself in the Hellenistic and early Roman eras. Herod's garden city, which he perfected, did not end with him. Cane fields and aqueducts created a second industry that settled alongside the dates and citrus. Grinding stones and water channels still lie in the ravines, where winter water descends from the Judean hills. Each one is a reminder that empires rise and fall, while the people in the oasis continue to make sweetness from water and sun. Ottoman registers in the early modern period depict Jericho as a small place among palms and fields. Travelers in the 17th and 18th centuries wrote with a mix of disappointment and wonder. They found ruins and groves, and a village whose houses huddled near the watercourses. They also found that the old road to Jerusalem still required a stop here for fodder and rest before the ascent. The 19th century sharpened this picture and gave it maps. European and American explorers arrived with notebooks, compasses, and a desire to correlate texts with terrain. Edward Robinson identified sites by listening to the Arabic names that preserved the old sounds. The Survey of Western Palestine, led by Claude Conde and Horatio Kitchener, sketched the wadis, springs, and sites with military precision. The Palestine Exploration Fund published neat plans of the tells and monasteries. In these pages, Jericho moves from legend to coordinate points. The spring is anchored by elevation. The tell is labeled with its Arabic and English names. The mosaic of memory begins to fill in with measurements. Archaeology then stepped from the page into the ground. In the early 20th century, Ernst Sellin and Karl Wartzinger opened trenches on the tell and in nearby sites. They worked in a period when excavation methods still mixed curiosity with rough handling. Yet, they helped frame the questions that would organize debate for decades. What did the earliest walls look like? When did the Bronze Age city rise, and when did it burn? How many times did people remake the ramparts? A generation later, Jum Garstang returned with improved field practice and a determination to find Joshua's city. His trenches exposed a massive fire layer, and he read the pottery to date the destruction to about 1400 BCE. The story seemed to snap into place. A walled city had burned, and the date looked right. Then came Kathleen Kenyon with a new grammar for digging. Starting in the 1950s, she cut deep, narrow sections through the mound, controlling the stratigraphy layer by layer, rather than clearing wide areas in great chunks. Her method slowed the work and multiplied the notebooks, but it yielded a sequence that could be trusted. At Jericho, it led to a surprise. The great fortified city Garstang linked to Joshua. She dated more than a century earlier. The destruction belonged to the end of the Middle Bronze Age, a time when several Canaanite cities met a similar fate. Later radiocarbon dates from charred grain inside the fire layer have buttressed her reading. Even scholars who disagreed with parts of Kenyon's interpretation had to answer to her method. Jericho became a classroom where archaeology learned to argue with evidence, not desire. While the debate over the Bronze Age dates made headlines, other teams turned the valley into a consistent archive. Ehud Netzer traced the ribbons of palace foundations at Tula Abu el-Alaik along the Wadi Kelt, and mapped the Hasmonean and Herodian pleasure complexes, down to the aqueduct intakes and the bath drains. His reconstructions showed a palace city tuned to water, a place where pools and channels were not ornamentation, but the infrastructure of power. Rooms where guests reclined beneath the winter sun, porticos where courtiers moved from an audience hall to a bath, open courts where figs dried and dates were stacked in the shade, all spoke to a political language that used gardens as theatre and treasury. Further north and west, restorers returned again and again to Khirbet al-Mafia to clean the stucco of salts and brush the sand from the mosaics. A quiet labor that feels like a vow to keep the memory readable. Modern Jericho also learned the harsh grammar of the 20th century. Under the British Mandate, the town grew along new roads, and hotels were built to service the motor age of pilgrimage. The Jericho Jordan cable car that now carries visitors to the Cliff Monastery is an heir to this impulse to move people across the view and the story. Earthquakes did not spare the valley in this century either. In 1927, a major quake rattled the Jordan corridor and damaged buildings from Jerusalem to the Gour. Jericho felt it in cracked walls and damaged aqueducts. The repair followed necessity, because the gardens and groves do not wait. Water regulators had to be reset. Channels had to be replastered. The logic of the oasis returned people to the practical. Wars redrew borders and daily life. In 1948, local notables met in Jericho to attempt to settle the fate of the valleys and ridges west of the river. In 1967, new lines were drawn across the regional map. In the 1990s, the first steps of a political accord returned the day-to-day management of Jericho and its environs to the newly formed Palestinian Authority. This handover was not a footnote. It made the city an early stage where new institutions learned how to manage archaeological sites and a tourist economy, while also managing schools, water, and roads. Conservation projects on the Tel and at the Umayyad Palace accelerated under this local management, sometimes with foreign technical aid, sometimes beneath the hands of masons and mosaicists trained in workshops in the town itself. Memory in the smoke and the final lesson the Tel continued to teach. Work by the Italo-Palestinian expedition resumed in the late 1990s and into the 21st century, reopening trenches with careful tools and new questions. Research teams brought methods to Jericho that would have looked like magic to earlier generations. Micromorphology slices of floor plaster showed how rooms were used and cleaned. Portable X-ray fluorescence mapped the chemistry of pigments on stucco and wall plaster. Ground-penetrating radar traced buried walls before a single shovel was engaged. Drones stitched hundreds of images into accurate 3D models. All this technology does not change the core truth that a trowel in a steady hand is what, in the end, uncovers a flaw or the edge of a jar. It changes what can be predicted and protected before the ground is disturbed. The wider public also learned a new way to see Jericho. Conservation guidelines stopped being purely academic. They became signs at site entrances, shaded platforms where visitors stood, and interpretative panels that speak of plaster recipes and channel slopes, as if they were characters in a plot. The most impressive step came when the mound itself was recognized by the world in formal terms. The ancient core of the site was inscribed on a list that exists to highlight places where the past speaks with unusual clarity about human history. The language of that recognition emphasized that at Tel Sultan, you can see the earliest steps into village life. The rise of urban fortification born of local soils and climates, and the continuity of settlements that connects eras, usually kept in separate textbooks. It was a bureaucratic act with a ceremonial feel, a seal on a long conversation between the spring and the people who serviced it. Every recognition carries a responsibility. The mound erodes if paths are poorly chosen, or if winter storms cut new gullies. The palace stucco at Khirbet al-Mafia crumbles when salts leach into it from wet soil. Mosaic floors that have survived for over 1,000 years darken beneath wind-blown dust and lighten under harsh cleaning. The answer to all these problems is banal and noble at once. It is training, funding, and pride. Local restorers now work side by side with foreign specialists. School groups visit the sites and hear that the faces on the plastered skulls are not trophies, but family portraits from a time when memory had to be modeled in lime. Guides learn to tell the difference between a Middle Bronze jar and a Roman amphora, so a visitor leaves knowing why shapes matter. The oasis as a whole becomes a classroom where science and history finally share the same breath. The modern city has learned to balance this role with ordinary life. Its markets sell oranges, dates, and herbs grown within easy biking distance of the tell. The road to the river and the eastern bridge is lively with buses and trucks carrying flour, people, and plants. Monks ring bells above the wadi. Calls to prayer echo off the cliff beneath the monastery. On festival days, pilgrims walk with purpose between the spring and the river. On quiet mornings, old men sit beneath the palms and play backgammon in the same shade where Hasmonean overseers once tallied a harvest. The continuity is not sentimental, it is practical. A good place dictates certain behavior if you want to live well there. A few images stand out in this long modern chapter. Restorers unrolling protective textile over a freshly cleaned mosaic, so a dust storm does not undo their work in a single night. A surveyor waking before dawn to set targets in the ruins of Herod's winter palace, so the shimmer of the midday air does not distort the measurements. A local school class crowded at the edge of a trench on the tell to watch an archaeologist lift a bag of charred barley from a floor where a roof once fell onto a basket. The moment when the teacher speaks quietly and tells the students that these seeds were the food of people, that they smell faintly sweet even after 3,000 years, and that this is how we know the season of the city's last day. Science becomes personal in such moments, and the oasis gains another set of guardians. The final lesson of Jericho's modern history is perhaps the simplest. A spring can be an anchor for a human community against changes that would shatter a less resilient place. Water falls through limestone high above the valley, collects in fractures, and emerges here as a permanent gift. The people who drink it learn to make shallow channels and keep them clean. They learn to plant where the wind breaks and to build where the floods struggle to reach. They learn to remake the communal life as needed, while keeping the private art of oasis living intact. Over a very long time, this becomes a kind of civic character. That is why the Neolithic Tower, the Canaanite glacis, the Herodian Pool, the Umayyad Bath, the Monk's Cell, and the modern visitor center can all feel like pages in the same book, rather than chapters from different volumes. Walk once more from the tell to the spring in the late evening. The light falls along the rough stone faces of the older structures. The palm fronds click slowly in the breeze. Water runs in channels that have never stopped needing attention. In that sound is Jericho's entire argument. The title of first city in the world may not be assigned without dispute. What the place can claim without any argument is something better. It is a 10,000-year demonstration that people and the landscape can learn each other so well that they become a single story.